Hello, Manchester, and welcome to another edition of Girard at Large. I am your proudly donning the Aftermath Addiction Treatment Center sweatshirt that was going to be presented to me last week by, Amanda Robichaud. I hope I get the first name right. Is it Amanda, Joe? I think it was Amanda.
Yes, it's Amanda.
Yes. The guest host Chrissy Cantor, as she shared her personal story with recovery, addiction and recovery, and the tremendous work she did while under contract with the city of Manchester, unfortunately run off the reservation by Adrienne Beloin, the now defunct manager of the Department of Housing Stability. It was clearly a case, and I said so at the time, of Queen Bee syndrome. Beloin did not, I think, appreciate the fact that Amanda Robichaud and her compatriots were getting unbelievable results, getting drug-addicted people off of the streets into treatment. And I was fascinated by what I learned as I watched the interview, or I don't know, could you call that an interview? You were there last time, Joe. It was almost like a confab between the two of those. I'm not sure it was really an interview, but as they shared their stories about the work that was being done. And it's tremendous when you think about, listen, I have made no bones about the fact that I don't believe there should be a homeless director here in the city of Manchester where they're directing homeless initiatives or they're, in charge of housing stability or whatever that means. But I will say this, if that position isn't going to go away, and I know that the mayor, yet again, doing something to validate an action taken by former Mayor Joyce Craig, which is why we often refer to him as JC 2.0. That would be Joyce Craig 2.0. Since he's bound and determined to find someone to fill that vital position. And actually, no, I don't think it's vital. And I've explained why over and over again. But I'm thinking Amanda Robichaud and her ability to get results from this population, her demonstrated ability to get results working with this population, is probably someone who should be considered for the job. Or maybe she knows somebody that might be interested. But we're going to talk about that and so much more today. Our phone number here is 603-698-3233. That's 603-698-3233. So we're going to stay with the whole Adrienne Beloin thing, and I'll tell you why. I think I've got a big I told you so here. Not that I'm ever one to pull an I told you so, but from time to time, I take no joy in being right when things are going wrong. But from time to time, I think the I told you so is appropriate, not to those of you who are listening, because of course, those of you who are watching this show and tune in week after week and listen, you're the audience. I mean, you get it, including, I think, several of the aldermen who I know tune in and don't always agree, but facts are stubborn things, right? So, Adrienne Beloin, who thinks, by the way, the stunt that she pulled in going after the Board of Mayor and Aldermen is going to enhance her career options. She said so in an interview from the union leader, following her dismissal. Here's where the I told you so comes in. I never thought terrible idea to pay her off to make her go away. The party line from the mayor is now, well, she was threatening to sue over things people said, and paying her off to go away and get this behind us, save the taxpayers a lot of money. Yeah, it was a drive-by lawsuit threat. So now all you have to do, if you are an aggrieved city employee of the city of Manchester, apparently, is threaten to take the city for court for something an alderman may or may not have said, and they'll pay you off to go away. This is one of the things, by the way, that has driven up medical malpractice insurance costs for doctors. They call them drive-by lawsuits. And what ends up happening is the insurance companies, whether the doctor screwed up or not, because it's cheaper to pay them off than it is to fight the lawsuit, they end up paying people off. And this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where it's like, hey, how much money can you get out of the piñata when you hit it this time? Whack, whack, whack. They just keep hitting the piñata. Why? Because every time you hit the piñata in this scenario, pennies fall from heaven. So she has no regrets. Now, in an interview with Paul Feely of the union leader, she says, I think the reaction to the way I interacted with them, meaning the aldermen, is a reaction that you often see when strong, intelligent women, said the woman who coined herself or said of herself that she was too overqualified for the job, are direct and are not going to roll over when more dominant voices try to cut them off. And of course, those dominant voices would be men. I think it's just a dynamic that exists, and I certainly don't regret any of the way that I stood up to that. What happened when I left the last board meeting was my hopes were really dashed that I was going to be able to work with this dominant part of the board, she said. It seemed very clear to me, and my decision to go ahead and be ultra-transparent, this is what she's calling herself, ultra-transparent, with what's really going on and how I really felt was a change and a decision I made in order to basically start the process of disengaging with my employer. So it was not a regret of mine, it was intentional. So in other words, it was intentional. She realized that she wasn't going to get her way. And I think it bears reminding you what caused this flare-up. What caused this flare-up was simply this. The Board of Mayor and Aldermen, after drug and alcohol a special committee chair and former chair, Kelly Thomas of Ward 12 and Bill Berry of Ward 10, went on a little tour of the facilities at 39 Beach Street, the 40 beds with all-day coffee that miraculously took all of these homeless people off our streets. Well, if you take a look around now that the weather's changed, Victory Park is once again a place where you do not want to walk through, despite the fact that there are ordinances banning bicycles and among other things. There are just heaps of trash in Victory Park. I'm going to get in trouble for calling it trash because those piles are somebody's personal belongings. The shopping carts that are full of God knows what. There are some people who aren't bringing them into the parks. They're following the rules, but they're leaving them in the parking spaces along Pine Street, for example. So they're not available for cars to park, or they're leaving them in a crosswalk. In other words, now that the weather has changed, the element that everyone was saying, gee, it seems like homelessness is getting better in the city of Manchester. Yeah, well, guess what? They're coming out of the woodwork now, and they're going right back to all the places they despoiled before. By the way, the Supreme Court of the United States heard a case earlier this week from the western part of the country, the one that's under these stupid rules from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal, the so-called Boise ruling that said, well, gee, you can't move them off of public land if there aren't any shelter beds available. You know, the one that our legal eagles here whose wings, if they aren't clipped, should be. Yeah, the ones that said, oh, because of that court ruling all the way on the other side of the country, which has no legal jurisdiction over this area. Our area is subject to the First Circuit Court of Appeals out of Boston. You know, the Supreme Court heard that one, and the arguments seemed favorable to the jurisdictions that wanted to be able to, I don't know, ban camping, remove people from public lands, all the stuff that we're being told that we can't do, but we really can. And now, hopefully, the Supreme Court will underline it for the whole country and not just the Ninth Circuit out on the crazy West Coast. But Adrienne Beloin went on. I think right now one of my biggest successes is that this current administration and the part of the board who has not been aligned with me and the mission and strategy I've laid out, I think these folks are questioning themselves right now. These are delusions of grandeur, I think, that border on narcissism. But I don't know any of the aldermen. Oh, that's right. We were saying the thing that set this all off was Adrienne Beloin refusing to follow a directive of the Board of Mayor and Aldermen that she locate her professional office as the person who is leading whatever you want to call this Department of Homeless stuff into the shelter with all-day coffee, use one of the offices there to base her operations out of. Of course, you know, this is the same person who complained about not having an office. And so the alderman, after taking a trip there and observing how things were running or not, decided maybe the boss should be on site so that the mice knew that the cat was around, kind of thing. And she vehemently opposed that and had all kinds of reasons about why it was not only unnecessary, but probably going to make things worse. And after that vote went through, she decided intentionally that she was going to start breaking away from her bosses at the Board of Mayor and Aldermen. And now she thinks they're questioning themselves. I don't know what she's smoking, but I think it's probably not legal, at least not yet in the state of New Hampshire. A source with direct knowledge of the situation said city officials expected Beloin to sue the city over recent comments by some officials saying it was in the long term, the settlement would save Manchester a lot of money in litigation costs. Folks, if you don't fight bogus legislation, this is like a temper tantrum. Those of you who are parents know a truth about temper tantrums. And that truth is while they're unpleasant when they happen, if the person pitching the temper tantrum, if the child pitching the fit gets what the child wants, you are guaranteed to see another fit, either from that child or another child that observes the effective tool that the temper tantrum fit pitching child pulled to get what they want. Okay? But this is the mentality. This is Jay Ruane. Make it go away. Pay her off. Pay her off. Homelessness is a massive issue in our community. Oh, this is Alderman Dan Goonan. We're going to be talking about him tonight, too. Homelessness is a massive issue in our community, and we need all hands on deck and work together. I have a different perspective, having been a former department head. I have been in that hot seat many a times, and it's not easy. And he goes on, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, Dan, we're going to be talking about Dan Goonan. Anyway, Beloin, back to Beloin. With this current administration, the way they want to drive the policy and drive the operations of the shelter or anything else that has to do with homeless initiatives is probably much safer in the hands of a nonprofit who is more aligned in my thinking and appreciates the concept of a low-barrier shelter and appreciates the concept that not every homeless person out there in the community is going to be able to get a job and find housing. Yes, this is someone who is collecting next to no data on the people in the shelter. And what data they are collecting is skewed, so it makes it look like 95% of everybody, in the system here in Manchester is from Manchester, because they only ask them where they came, if they've been here for 3 months or longer, and if they have, they're considered from Manchester. Where earlier studies done in prior years, going back to 2021, showed that more than 3/4 of the people on the streets in the city of Manchester not only weren't from the city, but had no affiliation with the city whatsoever. And why did they come here? They come here for one of three reasons: safe stations, illegally operating sober facilities, and of course, if you want to score some drugs, Manchester is the place to come to because we are overrun with the crap. From a point now, we are considered a distribution hub for a lot of these drugs to parts north, east, and west of here. We are no longer just the recipient of drugs from Lawrence and Lowell. We have now joined them as a distribution point because that's how much stuff is coming through here. But what do you expect when you have, according to sources that I've spoken to in the past week, over 120 illegally operating sober facilities here in the Queen City, on top of, still suffering the aftershocks of Safe Station, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Why are those sober homes a big deal? Because of the high percentage of people who get tossed out of them when they relapse. They end up where? No, they don't go back where they came from. And believe it or not, they're recruited actively from not only outside the city of Manchester, but outside the state of New Hampshire. Because as we reported years ago, after conversations with the people who operated them, there simply weren't enough addicts locally to support their operation, so they advertise heavily in Maine, Massachusetts, Vermont, Connecticut, and other parts of the Northeast to bring those who need recovery services here to our city because there aren't enough locally grown addicts to fill all of the available beds we have here in Manchester. True story. Can't make this stuff up. It's just one of those things where you got to grab the duct tape, wrap it around tight, and hope that when your head explodes, it catches enough of the pieces to put it back together. Okay, so, and she goes on, she says, if somebody comes in, she was asked to give advice to her successor. If somebody comes in and think that they're going to structure homelessness around broken systems like doorways or 211 or recovery-friendly workplaces, these are all initiatives that are basically posters with no work behind it. They're not serving the community. The board in this administration, I think they've already got it lined up who they're bringing in and the way they want to go about things, and it's no surprise that criminalization of homelessness is a big top priority. They're not going to do well with that approach, so I guess we'll have to see how it unfolds. You know, this whole idea that if you enforce the law against people who break the law, yes, even if they're homeless, yes, even if they're mentally ill, yes, even if they're drug addicts, that you're somehow criminalizing their being homeless is just part of the propaganda that these people who basically are endorsing lawlessness because of circumstance have in our city, okay? And this is not just a Manchester phenomenon. When Adrienne Beloin talks about bringing best practices from places like Boston where she's worked, does anybody, did Joyce Craig, did the Board of Mayor and Aldermen that approved her nomination and funded her position with ARPA funds and all this other, did anybody go to her and say, gee, you come from the city of Boston, you claim you have all of this great experience, please, show me the data where what you were doing in Boston reduced homelessness on the streets. Show me where what you did in Boston increased the number of people getting clean and sober. Show me where what you did in Boston led to people getting necessary mental health treatment and getting themselves back on the road to recovery. Show me. Have you been to Boston lately? Have you seen what they call the Miracle Mile, or used to call the Miracle Mile, and now it's covered with homeless people in tents? Have you? But this is her resume. This is what the woman who sings the virtues of all-day coffee at an engagement center where apparently, well, if you count being a couch potato, using your Obama phone and taking all of your public services in one location, if you call that engagement, which is what Kelly Thomas saw, which is what Bill Berry saw, which is what Chrissy Cantor saw, which is maybe why somebody accused Chrissy Cantor of stealing things that she didn't steal. I could tell you things I know about that, but I really can't. But there are things you should know because there were city employees involved in that political hit job against Chrissy Cantor. I won't name names, at least not yet. But did anybody ask the questions? No, of course not. Because if they did, they would find that there's nothing behind these alleged best practices, that there's nothing behind the idea that says, well, it doesn't matter if people don't have ID and we don't know who they are and we don't know where they're from. We need to meet them where they're at. You know, it seems to me that when there are not consequences, again, let's go to the idea of raising children, shall we? If you're not going to impose consequences for bad behavior on a child, what are you going to get from the child? And what's the child going to become? So why do we treat these people who break the law Granted, they may be out of their mind on drugs. They may be out of their mind because they're mentally ill. But when we say, well, because you're out of your mind for reason X or reason Y, you are not accountable for what you do, where does it come, the idea, where does it come to their mind that maybe they should behave differently? In a consequence-free world, what's the motivation? I come back to an article written by Dennis, oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank on his last name, former county attorney here in Hillsborough County, Dennis Hogan, in an op-ed that he wrote about how one of the worst things that the state did that caused the homeless problem to explode was bail reform and the fact that people were let go even before their paperwork was processed. Because once they have to go to the Valley Street Jail, once they have to sit there, once they're in the presence of medical facilities, rehab facilities, mental health facilities, the system, as he says, touches them in that place, and many of them take advantage of the services to get better. But when they're not touched by the system, isn't that why we have drug court, by the way? So if you've got some drugged out homeless person who craps on the picnic tables at Creamland or steals the bicycles and propane tanks from your backyard, okay? You know, they go before a judge and the judge, you know, they go before the judge at drug court and the judge says, hey, we can put you in the clink for a couple years, or you can go to rehab and check in with this court and make sure your recovery's underway. If we're not putting them into the system so we're even using the things that we put in place to help people who are struggling with drug addiction, why would we expect anybody to take advantage of it? You know, they just might be in their right mind enough to say, well, a couple years in jail doesn't sound like fun. Maybe I'll try rehab. But we're not even doing that. So the idea, we criminalize homelessness. No, you're not criminalizing homelessness. You're holding people to account for their behavior and giving the system that is there not to punish them, because remember, we can't have punishment in our society, but to rehabilitate them and help them become productive members of society again. Yes, yes, yes. But we're not using the system for that. That is somehow unfair. And this, by the way, is what happens when the liberals and the libertarians get together in the New Hampshire legislature to push dumb ideas that have consequences to society in the name of their respective agendas, because, you know, the right is all, those libertarians are all about rights without responsibilities, and the liberals are all about, you know, I don't even know what they're about. They're just about, you know, destroying the existing social order, and it's working. So, but that's the deal. So people like Amanda Robichaux, who were getting tremendous results from that, she and one other person that she worked with, responsible for getting over 120 people off the streets of Manchester and into rehab services. And she did it in 90 days. And if you remember, there was great conflict between Amanda Robichaux and her organization, and Adrienne Beloin, too qualified for the job. And of course, Beloin ultimately forced them out because, well, I guess maybe they were making her look bad, but irony of ironies, she was complaining about their lack of reporting data. And even during the latest kerfuffle, when people brought up, I think it was Bill Berry, brought up the success that Amanda and her organization had had in a very short period of time, and you know, Adrienne Beloin, All Day Coffee, was sitting there saying, "Oh, but you know how many of those people relapsed and ended back up on the streets?" So, what's your point? Because they relapsed and ended up back on the street, we shouldn't try to get them off the street? Or they get to hang out at your shelter your engagement center and drink all-day coffee all day long while still doing drugs. And we know they were doing drugs because there were overdoses in the shelter. Yes, yes, but that's okay. Now, in her absence, the mayor, bold action, got $1,000 from Members First Credit Union and is working with Catholic Charities to provide people with ID cards and birth certificates if they don't have them. Giving them ID cards and birth certificates is a great step forward in helping them, you know, come back to society, which I'm not saying it isn't. But what are we going to do when we find out that a certain percentage of these people aren't going to have birth certificates and aren't going to get ID cards because they're not citizens? And you know there are. And, you know, so what do we do about that? Are we going to call ICE and take them away? We're going to find out where these people are really from and notify the communities that they came from and maybe get them to start kicking over some cash for us to take care of their people? We're going to find out why they came to Manchester? Because if we're going to find out why they came to Manchester, we're going to find out that this city has been exceedingly permissive, been exceedingly accommodating, refusing to enforce the law under the idea that we can't criminalize. It just drives me crazy when I see police chiefs say, well, we can't arrest our way out of this. Really, we can't? You've got over 700 beds at the Valley Street Jail, and you have an ongoing average census there on a daily basis of about 200. You could arrest the entire homeless population of the city of Manchester as we know it today. All of the people on the streets, you know, under bridges, in the woods, in the parks, wherever they are, and still have probably 100 or 2 beds left over at Valley Street Jail. Now, I'm not suggesting they should be arrested because they're homeless, but when they commit crimes, yes, they should be arrested, and the system should determine what their punishment is. If we can ever get the damn bail laws fixed, we might be able to hold them long enough for that to happen. Okay? And so there it is. The idea that we can't enforce, that we shouldn't enforce the law because it somehow won't solve the problem. Well, if that's the case, what do we have the laws for? Why bother having laws against any of the stuff that these homeless people regularly violate? Again, what's the point? What's the point? And if you're going to enforce it against me, they're going to enforce it against you, but they're not going to enforce it against this one because of whatever circumstance. We have something known as selective enforcement, and that is a constitutional violation. It's called the Equal Protection of the Laws Clause of the 14th Amendment of these United States' Constitution. So why should some people get pinched for crimes while others not? Oh, they're impaired. Is that what you're going to tell me? Well, that's for the court to determine through argument by prosecution and defense, perhaps even including the judgment of a jury to determine what the appropriate course of action is based on those specific circumstances. But for police chiefs to be determining that they're not going to enforce the law because we can't arrest our way out of this problem is to say that the problem is more important than the underlying crimes that are a problem for a much broader number of people. Now, there's a situation happening before we get to the budget, and while we're on this topic, I am sorry, chuckling at Facebook Live. So here's what you need to know. There is another sober home that is opening in a neighborhood where the use is not allowed. It's the corner of Brook and Walnut Streets at 120 Brook Street. This is something that I've been aware of for several weeks, and I've been working with neighbors, you know, right along rather diligently to help them build a case that they can take to the city. And here's what we know, okay? First off, you've got an alderman in Dan Goonan that has not lifted a finger to help this neighborhood. He says, well, he's looked into it, and there's nothing the city can do because they're saying that the sober home is going to follow the new definition of family, something that yours truly went to the board to oppose, and will cap the number of people per unit at 4 unrelated adults, because the city considers 4 unrelated adults to be a family. And well, since they're going to do that, there's nothing that we can do about it. Well, that's helpful. So as the neighbors have watched what's gone on at this building since it's been bought, but before I get to that, the people who have bought the building on Brook Street currently own a property at 72 Kelly Street. And it has been operating as a sober home for several years at that location. And one of the things that's got me scratching my little wooden head is that that property on Kelly Street has got more space, more bedrooms, more bathrooms, and it's got 20 beds. So why would an organization that currently has 20 beds operating in the city be moving to a property where, if they followed the rules, they would only have 12 beds available? That doesn't make a lot of sense. And they aren't operating both, from what I understand. They're moving from one to the other. They're moving from bigger to smaller. Why are they doing that? Well, I have been working right along with people who are following this closely, and there's some disturbing information that's coming forward, information that has been brought to the city, and the city's basically gone, eh. And it's a pattern of behavior that we have seen over and over and over again as these sober home operators from out of state come in here and seek forgiveness once they're caught rather than permission to do it the right way. What am I talking about? Oh, I'm talking about the out-of-state contractors, electricians, plumbers, carpenters. And you know they're electricians, plumbers, and carpenters for out-of-state because you can see their vehicles, who show up one day, do all kinds of work, and then leave. Neighbors call the building department, and the building department says, well, unless we catch them in the act, there's nothing we can do about it. Which, frankly, boys and girls, is horse crap, because if they walked in there and they saw unpermitted work, which isn't difficult to see, well, then they know that the owners have done unpermitted work. So the city's not being terribly helpful. And the neighbors who, are reporting these things, they're starting to understand what they need to do, like take pictures of all of this stuff when it's happening so that you can build the case. The other thing that we have learned is that this really is not a use that complies with the zoning ordinance. Why? Because, well, through property records and things like that, you can determine who's owned, who's bought the property. And then you discover that there are agreements in place between the property owner and a sober home operator who leases the property. And that sober home operator that leases the property sublets the rooms to its clients, its patients, to its constituents, whatever you want to call them. So there is no direct lease agreement between the people in the apartment units and the owner, because the direct lease agreements exist between the company managing the business entity, the for-profit business entity operating the sober facility, and the owner, and then there will be arrangements between the operating manager and the people who live there. And the people who live there will have their rent paid either by Medicaid, which is you, the taxpayer, or their private insurance because they're in recovery. And if the rates that they'll be charging here are similar to rates that we know of in other parts, they'll be paying anywhere from $250 to $400 a week. And insurance, whether it's taxpayer provided through Medicaid or otherwise, will be footing the bill. Now, we have examples of this stuff around the city where they have been caught and forced to go to the planning board if they were in the right zoning district. There was one at 273 Dubuque Street where the building department in a back and forth with the operator. And if I'm not mistaken, the people involved in this thing at Brook Street are some of the same people who were involved in this thing on Dubuque Street, which are some of the same people who were involved on Russell Street and on Orange Street and on the corner of Bremer and Reed Street and various other places around the city where they were eventually confronted and shut down, or supposed to be shut down, but still are operating 3 years later, as in the case of Orange Street. So we have a lot of the same players involved, and so we know how this works. And at the time, the city said, hey, listen, to the people operating Dubuque Street, they said, look, you have an owner renting to a sober home operator, and the sober home operator, in addition to providing on-site staff who lives there free of charge, is also subletting those spaces to clients of theirs, people in recovery. That is not an allowed use because it is a boarding house. And if you want to get your boarding house legitimized, in this case on Dubuque Street, you have to get a conditional use permit from the planning board. And Mike Landry wrote a brilliant legal letter. He's a lawyer, in addition to being the head of the Building Regulations Enforcement Division, whatever they call it now, outlining it and setting the standard, okay, for what the city considered to be a rooming house or a boarding house operation. And lo and behold, what do we have on Brook Street? We have the exact same kind of arrangement on Brook Street, where neighbors who, interestingly enough, have talked not only to some of the out-of-state workers who have been doing unpermitted work, and we know it's unpermitted work because people have called to see if any permits have been pulled, and they haven't, but also talking to some of the people who are involved in operating the sober home, and they say, well, you know, we're actually moving 20 beds in here. Well, gee, there are 3 units, and 3 units times 4 people is 12. 20 would be more than 12. And 20 would be more than the zoning ordinance allows, even if it was an allowed use. Well, says Dan Goonan in an email to various people or discussions with various people, well, there's no way for us to enforce that, so there's nothing we can do. I remind you that once upon a time, somebody went to City Hall to say, you shouldn't change it this way because not only are you not defining your terms, even if you were, there would be no way for the city to enforce these regulations. And now, no sooner said than done, you have aldermen out there saying it, and Dan Goonan has long had it. This is the same Dan Goonan who, as fire chief, of his own decision, of his own volition, decided he wasn't going to enforce the life safety codes that are the purview of the fire department to enforce on all of these illegally operating sober homes because, in his words, as it was said in the newspaper, he believed these people needed decent places to advance their recovery. Now, I don't disagree with that, and I'm not opposed to having recovery facilities, but I am opposed to people who not only violate the rules but flaunt them and then turn around and act like they didn't have to follow them because of federal laws, even though there are court cases, which I have again given to the Board of Mayor and Aldermen, that say, yeah, no, enforcement of your building codes and your zoning ordinances does not violate the, any of those federal statutes. Americans with Disability Acts, the Fair Housing Act, doesn't violate anything. And communities are not required to give, to waive access or, waive application of those things if doing so would defeat the purpose of having them. Huh? How about that? So Goonan, who's been an apologist for this, Goonan, who in his capacity as the chief code enforcement officer of the life safety code that the fire department has sole jurisdiction over enforcing, refused to enforce any of the codes on the buildings where they were illegally operating, and moreover, got called out by the building, the planning director at a community meeting in January of 2020, and you can find it at GirardAtLarge.com. Just go for, just Google Goonan's name. You can see the write-up of the whole meeting, and you can listen to the audio tape where he said, oh yeah, we've been sharing that information with the building department, and the planning director flat out said, no, nobody's ever given us that information. So Goonan has an agenda here, and it's not about protecting the neighborhoods that he represents or the citizens who live in them. It's about his misguided belief that we need these things, so by hook or by crook, we should allow them to operate. And the changes that the city has made in the zoning ordinance to change the definition of family and to eliminate having to prove, which they wrongly said was required by state law. I read the state law that they referenced, and it was for people who had physical disabilities, like someone who needed a wheelchair ramp to access their home. They said, well, you can't prove, you don't, in that case, you don't have to prove that the zoning imposes a hardship on the property, that the property can be used within the zoning, okay? Now, variances normally go from owner to owner. They stay with the property in perpetuity as long as the use continues. But in this case, where the state was very specific about providing relief where there was a physical disability, they said, and yes, the zoning board can condition the exception to the zoning rule for the person with the physical disability as long as that person with the physical disability lives at the property. Once they're no longer at the property, the variance will expire. Well, how does that work with a sober home? But anyway, so all of these changes that the city's making have made it easier for sober home operators like this one to cheat the system. They're saying, oh, well, we don't need to go and get a permit because we're only going to have 4 people, wink, 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 per unit, and that's allowed under the new definition of family. Well, maybe it is allowed under the new definition of family if you're a landlord leasing directly to the people, but not if you're a landlord leasing to a management company that's then going to bring people in on its own terms. That makes it a rooming house, a boarding house, and we're having a hell of a time, which is why I'm bringing it public now, of getting the city to recognize that. So lawyers are about to get involved, and paperwork's going to start to fly. But when you have building departments that are saying, oh, well, we can't inspect unless we can catch them in the act, which is horse crap, and there is an alderman, and I'm just sure, well, Pat Long has been met with the neighbors. The neighbors invited him, the alderman at large, Goonan to a neighborhood meeting. Goonan didn't show. The alderman at large had conflicts, and Pat Long attended. And he's actually been very helpful, and he's running down some of this information. And so, there is some hope. Some of the neighbors there also reached out to Alderman Cantor, who has said that she will do whatever she can because she's fighting the good fight on one of these things in her ward. And, but you need to know that these things are happening, and it's destructive to your quality of life. Now, as I've been researching this and talking to people, I came across somebody who was told 3 years ago in a conversation with then Mayor Craig that there are over 120 of these operating in the city. That is a devastating assault on the neighborhoods across the city. You want to know why we continue to have problems with drugs and homelessness and, people on the streets and everything else? Yeah, you keep bringing in a drug-dependent class of people who are going to wash out of those recovery homes. Listen, folks, I live literally across the street from one of these things. The turnover in these things is unbelievable. You see a different set of cars out front literally every 3 or 4 months. Every now and then, the fire trucks, the ambulances, and the cops show up, so there's been an overdose. They're dead to the neighborhood as neighbors. Really, they are. They do unpermitted work. These are the people who are going to, if this new zoning ordinance passes, they're going to take you don't need to go to the planning board to create an accessory dwelling unit. Bang, that garage is going to be gone. They'll create it as another unit, and they'll have another 4 people living there where they already have 11 in a 3-bedroom, bath and a half, single-family home. That very clearly can be used in the zoning as a single-family home without any hardship. But, the city wants to get rid of that, too. and blame it on state law, which if anybody actually read the state law, they know it does not apply to this recovery stuff, okay? So these are the types of things that are happening in your neighborhoods and in your city. And if you're seeing a decrease in your quality of life, it's because this stuff is happening and you have willing accomplices in people like Dan Goonan, while other people are trying to figure out ways around this, especially when you have a bureaucracy that in proposing some of these changes sings the praises of whatever mayor is in office at the time that was pushing them, like Roué pushed this bogus thing on eliminating the requirement that you prove that the zoning imposes a hardship on the on the property, and Craig pushing through the thing that changed the definition of family. Well, our lawyers told us that we needed to change the definition of family. Really? You need to get different lawyers then, because they just opened your neighborhoods up to an assault that you can't stop, because even if you could, it's completely unenforceable the way they've put it together. And so that is a problem, and we need to keep an eye on it. Okay, so hopefully, and if you are having issues like this in your neighborhood, send me an email, rich@girardatlarge.com. I'll do what I can to share my experience fighting these things around the city and, sharing my knowledge on how to get it addressed by the city. But at the end of the day, folks, you just got to start going to the Board of Mayor and Aldermen and demand that they change the rules or force the bureaucracy or both to do the job that needs to be done here. Because unless pressure, Will Stewart, the former alderman from Ward 2, had the fear of God put into him when he organized a neighborhood meeting, saw 120 neighbors go to the community room at the Mount Carmel nursing home over the sober homes that had opened up on Russell and Orange Streets, and heard 120 neighbors unanimously say, "Oh, hell no." And suddenly he became a crusader against these things. Of course, he had to couch it in the proper progressive language about being, they're profiting off of people's drug addiction. These are evil for-profit corporations. Implying that somehow if they've been, nonprofit corporations, they would have been angelic or something. But at least he found an excuse to help his neighborhoods oppose them. Goonan has got no such inclination, and he never will. So moving on to the budget. I have to tell you something. I had hoped to have different information to share with you, but getting information on the mayor's budget proposal has been somewhat frustrating. Normally when a budget is proposed, there's something called a budget book. And the budget book provides the line item detail on all of the spending proposed by the mayor. And that budget book will normally include all of the things that the departments asked for that the mayor didn't fund, because what the mayor puts out is generally a summary. How many ever millions of dollars for the police department, the fire department, this department, that department, the general revenue projections. So you get summaries of what the mayor did in the mayor's budget presentation, but you don't get the line item detail. That comes separately. We are now more than a month away from when the mayor proposed his budget, and that detail, that line item detail, still has not been released. Okay, your budget presentation isn't exactly transparent when you have more line item detail coming out of the school district than you do coming out of the mayor's office. There is no excuse for that information not to be available yet. And in my stack of stuff here, one of the articles that was there was about the alderman hiking health insurance premiums for the city employees plan by 10%. Listen, the aldermen did more than I thought they were going to do, but that whole conversation just proved why the aldermen should not be given the opportunity to vote on what the increase in premiums should be. First of all, you get people like Tony Sapienza. God bless him. He thought he knew what he was talking about, and he was really convinced that he did, but he didn't have a clue. Okay? he had no clue that when the city increased what it put in, it automatically increased what the employees put in. He wanted to do something entirely different because while the city went up by this percent, and so the employees should only, so we should, he had, and he couldn't, and nobody could disabuse him of the idea. Now, in his defense, okay, people like Sharon Wickens, who should not have that job, she was about as clear as mud. And, you know, these department heads are so damned afraid of offending an alderman that when they're flat out wrong, they don't say, no, I'm sorry, alderman, that's not how it works. It works this way. So there's no clarity in any of the answers. You know, Rouet finally got to a point where he was presenting something clearly, but it just, you know, by that point, Tony Sapienza had dug himself so deep into a hole that he was just not going to come out of it. So the consultants, I mean, you pay these consultants good money. They said your rates should go up 16%. Lost in this discussion was last year the consultants said, you know, you really should raise your rates 10%, but the aldermen, because they knew better, they only raised it 7%. And that's why there's $1.5 million hole in that account right now that's going to have to be covered by you, the taxpayers, to fill that gap. So now they're saying, well, it should be 16%. I guess they ratcheted it down to 13%. You had the really not qualified for the job Sharon Wickens, the finance director, when they was, well, you know, they're saying it's 16, but I'm really uncomfortable with that number. I think you shouldn't go any higher than 12. But she didn't give any reason for that other than she just thought it was too high at 16. You know, didn't think people would like that. Well, they're going to be thrilled with 12? Well, so maybe it came down to 13 in the intervening 2 weeks. And then, you know, they were still at 12, but the board passed a motion that said it's only going to go up 10. So the last time the board didn't follow the recommendation of the consultant, they ended up with $1.5 million hole. So we're going to try it again. We're going to try it again. And, you know, the alderman should not have been put in that position. The mayor's budget should have not been released without incorporating the recommendations of the consultants. Having written my fair share of budgets, I can tell you quite honestly that until Joyce Craig started playing games with this, and Jay Rouet probably didn't even realize it was a game that started, okay? He's only been in the city 2.5 years, something like that, so he's got no history with the city, no history with the government, no institutional knowledge whatsoever. And here we are. Once again, we're going to short sheet what the consultants say and hope that we either have surplus or enough in the health insurance reserves at the end of the year if the consultants prove to be right. The mayor's budget should come in with the recommendation of the consultants. And if at some point in the future the consultants refine that recommendation, it needs to go up, it needs to go down, then the alderman can get involved. But it's a complete train wreck, but the board has voted. I will give Goonan credit on this. He broke ranks with the Democrats, voted with the Republicans to increase it by 10%, where all the Democrats voted with Tony Sapienza to raise it by less than half of what the recommendation was. Yeah, great. Setting yourself up for a $3 to $4 million pothole in your budget is really brilliant, okay? But that's what they did, so I'll give kudos to the Republicans, the Republican alderman and Dan Goonan for voting for a 10% increase, knowing that it probably really should be 13, but at least it's better than 7. And here we go again. But, you know, I have been looking at the budget. I have been looking at numbers. There are, as I said in my test, you know, the funny thing is Union Leader completely skipped reporting any of the public comments on the budget, which is too bad. I was going to show you some clips tonight, but I figured I wouldn't have time because when you get guys like Jim O'Connell coming in and saying that, you know, without naming me, that they're in a fact-free zone when they talk about the budgets, and then he takes credit for building the reserves, among other things, and doesn't acknowledge that last year in the current budget, they got a $38 million increase in spending which is carried over, and that Roué added another $1 million on top of that because they got, they got what they got under the tax cap last year, which they cheated. By saying, oh, we're going to take money out of our expendable trust funds, count it as a revenue, so we can increase spending where the tax cap said we should have cut it. Okay, so they played that little trick. Then they moved about $7 million in operating expenses into ESSER funds, or was it 10? I think it was 10. No, maybe it was 7. 7. Okay, so they played all kinds of games, so they didn't actually have to cut their spending to stay within the cap. Then, after the state budget went through and they changed the adequacy formula, Manchester got another $35 million, which the Board of Mayor and Aldermen allowed the schools to take. Rather, what they could have done is they could have put it all on the tax rate and cut your taxes by 15%, but no, they didn't do that. They gave it to the schools, and the school says, well, we're going to spend $13 million on pay raises, we're going to spend $20 million on our, our business, our building boondoggle, and we're going to spend the rest of it on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. And the Board of Mayor and Aldermen said, oh, okay, I think Levasseur and Cantor and Sapienza were the only 3 who voted against that. So $35 million fell into their budget. But still they come and they say, gee, if you don't give us everything we ask for, the children are going to graduate stupid. Well, they're already graduating stupid if you're looking at our graduation rates, if they're graduating at all, if you take a look at our proficiency rates. But the idea that if they don't get on top of that $35 million, another $6 million because the tax cap says they can, is laughable. Because when you take a look at how they spent that $35 million, not a penny of it is going to improve student achievement. There is no evidence, no evidence whatsoever that building programs improve academic performance. And if pay raises improved academic performance, then Manchester would be, routinely enrolling kids in Mensa and sending them off to, whatever school, halfway through their high school career, because the pay raises that we have given the people in the school district over the last 5 to 10 years have well outpaced inflation. That's a fact. When I was chairman of negotiations, I went back to, I think, the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, and I did the math, and the math said that salary increases in the city of Manchester for its teachers and principals outpaced inflation by 30%. So every dollar that went up in inflation, the teachers' pay went up $1.30. Okay, we have not shortchanged our teachers by any stretch of the imagination, but we keep playing these games. And so there's a fair amount of detail on the school budget, and that is easy to take a look at. And one of these days, I'll show you what's going on there. But there is zero detail coming out of City Hall about the budget other than what the mayor put in as a summary in his presentation. So no line item detail more than a month after the mayor proposed his budget. And that, folks, is not only unacceptable, it's unprecedented in the history of city budgets. And it certainly does not show that there's transparency. So I had not planned to speak at the board meeting following the public hearing on the budget, but after hearing Jim O'Connell flat out lie about how the school board scrimped and saved to create those reserves, which were created when money fell out of the sky from Concord, back when Dr. Vargas was superintendent, which means I was on the board, Kelly Thomas was on the board, Ross Terrio was on the board. That's where those reserves came from. They talked about reductions in aid. Here's something. Oh, yes, well, we lost state aid. Yeah, I see the wrap-up. Yeah, you lost state aid because you have fewer students, and your bright idea to give everybody free and reduced hot lunch meant people weren't turning in their forms to qualify for it, and the state awards aid based on that too. So you had a massive drop-off in the number of kids that qualified based on what's on those forms that nobody's filling out now. Why should they? They're getting it free now. So everything that you're seeing happening at the schools budgetarily is a direct result of decisions that school board has made and has nothing to do with whether or not they're being shortchanged on funding. I am your ever humble host, Rich Girard. Thanks for tuning in. Until next week, be good, be well. Don't do anything we wouldn't do. We're proud to have in the audience. Thanks so much for being there. Until next week, be good. And thanks to you on...